To state the obvious, technological innovation at the outset of this millennium has been nothing short of revolutionary, and it shows no signs of slowing down. Jim Balsillie, the former co-CEO of Research in Motion, says Canada is not keeping up. Worse, that policymakers and businesses still don't seem to fully appreciate the scope of the change underway. He is now chair of the Council of Canadian Innovators, and Jim Balsillie joins us now for more. Great to have you back in our studio.
Pleasure to be with you, Steve.
This is always fun to do off the top, is to remind people what they said last time they were here and see if it all jives a few years later. But you were in that chair 3 years ago, and here's what you had to say. Sheldon, if you would.
Canada's had zero growth in its innovation measured by Stats Canada over 30 years, in spite of hundreds of billions of dollars of investment. And all of these programs are just the same thing we've done before. I'm all for good infrastructure, I'm all for incubation, I'm all for basic research, but it's not going to address the core issue of why we abysmally underperform. The problem in Canada is that we have a discourse in the policy circles and in the business organization leaders and the political class that is really mired in 30, 40 years ago, 20th century traditional manufacturing economy. So they haven't updated their understanding of how an ideas economy works.
That was your warning in 2015. In 2017, you wrote in the Globe and Mail that, quote, Canada has the most superficial discourse around innovation policy in any of the 140 countries I've done business in. We're now in 2019. Is the story any different?
Yeah, I think you should. It's pretty similar. I think you should just play the old interview again and we'd be good. I mean, I will say this, that there is a small handful of civil servants led by Minister Baines that are really, really trying to understand innovation and I give them credit for the ad hoc things that they're doing and they're working on, but they're such a small minority. And the problem with innovation is it requires a deliberate and systemic approach. And it's kind of like surgery. You can't do a few things right and a few things wrong. You got to do it all right.
2 years ago, you said Microsoft owns 1,030 machine learning patents, while all of Canada owns only 48, and half of these are owned by BlackBerry. Has that picture changed? It's
gotten worse. There's a patent cooperation treaty of global patents, and they came out in the last 3 years of the 152 member countries around the world. Canada's last place in its performance in the last 3 years. So we faded. We haven't figured out that in the intangibles economy, the ideas economy, it's about accumulating intangible assets. That's the #1 job, is you have to accumulate valuable intangible assets that you then commercialize. And if you do that right, you acquire a lot of IP and data assets. And we don't have a policy orientation in that because our policy community doesn't understand how the innovation economy works.
You mentioned innovation, you mentioned Navdeep Baines a second ago. He has a title that includes the word innovation and a lot of other stuff as well. But he did recently make that announcement about creating superclusters with almost $1 billion worth of government funding backstopping that. Do you give the government some kudos for that?
Well, the mistake of it is we've done lots of granting programs over the decades, but the way they're approaching the superclusters currently, granted they're trying to fix it on the fly, is that you're not going to accumulate intangible assets just by spending money. You have to have an IP strategy, an intellectual property strategy, and a data strategy that says the objective that we're aiming at is to accumulate valuable intangible assets.
You want to define that? An intangible asset for you is what?
Well, it's an idea that you own or data that you own. So it's something you can collect a rent for. So if you say, I own this software, or I own this patent, or I own this data set, and I get money for something that's an idea. And so if we don't build those in a way that the ownership of them, accumulate them in a way that accrues benefit to the Canadian economy, then what we end up doing is subsidizing the wealth for foreign countries with Canadian taxpayer money, which is what we've been doing for the last 30 years.
Okay, let me put another program to you. You've heard of this one too, the Strategic Innovation Fund, pool of money set aside by Ottawa 2017, quote, to spur innovation for a better Canada. So far, they've spent more than $800 million on 32 projects. What are your thoughts about how well that's working?
Well, again, I mean, you know, to make innovation happen, it requires a very sophisticated public-private framework where you accumulate intangible assets that you can commercialize to the benefit of our economy, and we don't have that framework. So I'm sure these are very good companies. I know some of them. They're very hardworking. They're good people.
That got the grants, you mean?
Some of them, yeah, and absolutely using fiscal resources is a very, very important part of an innovation strategy. But until we understand, the policy community understands the core principles, we will always enormously sub-optimize. So however these things perform, they'll perform in spite of the ecosystem, the policy ecosystem, not because of it.
I thought you might be a little tougher on that one, actually. I thought you might say something like, that reeks of good old-fashioned pork barrel, industrial, regional policy grants, which actually are about propping up losers and not necessarily...
No, because I don't want to be pejorative on this, because the government has an enormous role to play in the innovation economy. Because it's based on a principle of restriction, that I own an idea. You can only own an idea because the government says you can. And so the government has a central role to play on this, including buying products, investing in R&D, managing the system very, very in a coordinated fashion for the companies. So you absolutely have to invest in these, but you have to invest in them with completeness. Our issue is not what we invest. Our issue is the incompleteness of the approach, because our policy community never updated the difference between the tangible economy and the intangible economy.
How about, and you pick the acronym you like here, USMCA or USMCA or US-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement, or whatever we're calling it these days, NAFTA too. How did Canada do in terms of intellectual property protections in that agreement?
Well, we did, for purposes of the effects on Canada, it's very, very damaging to Canada in a permanent fashion. The way the U.S. works is they bubble up the wording for these agreements in all of their private sector advisory committees, and they say, here's the words we want to make our companies richer. So they've made the IP provisions longer and stronger and broader so that the rich get richer. So if you're a landlord, you get bigger rent, and when you're a tenant, you pay more rents, and they kind of lock you into that in a permanent point of view. So the structure of the USMCA is that it's going to be very, very hard for Canada to reverse its course correction innovation, and we're going to end up paying a lot more checks to America, and America is going to collect more checks because America wants to, the innovation sector is a $7 trillion a year sector in America, and they want to make it 14 trillion, and they're going to play tough to make themselves rich.
If there's a 7 trillion, what's ours?
Well, I don't know the exact number because we really don't have an organized focus for pulling this together. And part of they have, very organized lobby groups and business associations and research and advisory structures that build that up. Part of Canada, we disbanded our advisory systems 16 or 17 years ago because we didn't need advice. And that's when the US really doubled down on their advisory systems, because you have to, the ideas economy tweaks hundreds of times a day. And so that's what lobbying's about. That's what getting these trade agreements and regulations and standards, and both in your country and into foreign countries. And we down-geared our capacity in that, just after year 2000, and the US up-geared theirs, as did Europe and China and Japan and Korea and Israel. Everyone up-geared theirs, and we down-geared ours because we went hands-off when everyone went double hands-on.
Is it your hope that this Council of Canadian Innovators that you're part of will get us back up gearing?
Well, that is the whole objective of it, which is really to speak on behalf of Canadian domestic innovators. We got captured fundamentally by foreign companies that said their wealth is Canada's wealth, and that's just not how economics and innovation works. So we have a group that's working very closely with the policymakers and federally and provincially to try to reorient the government to understand that it's through these scale-ups that you're going to get the prosperity you want. Their success is Canada's success. So we're trying to, yes, rebuild that, and we're having some success, and I mentioned with some smart civil servants and Minister Baines, but you have to understand that we're reversing decades of maladaptive orthodoxy. So those good people who are trying to learn and help are very, very much the minority.
This is a federal election year in Canada, and there are going to be a lot of people putting out report cards on how well the government is doing on various files. What letter grade would you give the Trudeau government on the innovation file?
Well, I can't really give them a grade because they haven't done innovation. What they really did was focus on cheap labor, foreign tech branch plants. So, you know, they made a decision that Canada doesn't have the potential to be an innovation country, that we're really about, you know, cheap labor to let foreign companies become successful. And I never could understand why we went for the branch plant pennies instead of the innovation billions. So
maybe because you're the only guy who's ever done, right? I mean,
there's many, and there's great. We have great innovators. We have great entrepreneurs. They're fantastic, and you know, the reason we're having trouble is we're giving away our best ideas, and we're giving away our best talent, and we're giving the best access to foreign countries. So you cannot confuse a tech branch plant for jobs with an innovation strategy. And you have to understand, the official government position for the Amazon bid is our talent is 37% cheaper than yours, and we're going to work hard to keep it that way. Like, what government says I'm going to work hard to keep our people's wages down and then say, well, we have a productivity problem?
I read your stuff in the Globe and Mail, of course, when you do the op-ed pieces from time to time, and you said something in one recently that really was very, well, put it this way, it's sort of opposite of everything I've been led to believe until I read that, which is that PIPA, intellectual property policies, are fundamentally different from the way the regular economy works, in as much as all the traditional rules about how you make money, get goods and services to market are, if I can put it this way, ass backwards. Can you explain that?
The ideas economy is the opposite of free trade. See, in the tangible production economy, what you do is you get rid of, tariffs. You compete on cost. You get bigger markets, and you get scale, and you get efficiencies, and everybody trades based on their comparative advantage. So everybody's got an incentive to cooperate. When you come to the ideas economy, you try to claim ideas and say, I've got a monopoly, and I charge a rent for you. So it's not a trading system anymore, it's a rent system. And the landlord wants the highest rents, and the tenant wants the lowest rents. And so the more restriction and constraints you can put in it to your benefit, the better you win. Whereas in the free trade, the more you get them out of the way, everybody wins. So in free trade, there's an incentive to cooperate, but in the ideas economy, it creates rivals. And so you have to be much more national, if you will, enlightened national in your approaches, or you get gamed by those that do it. So it's a completely different system that works by completely different rules. And my comment before is we never updated our toolkit, our policy community, over the past 30 years while the rest of the world was. And that's why our outputs shrunk when the rest of the world soared.
Tell me if I'm drawing the wrong inference here, though. It sounds like you're saying, in the old economy, monopoly is bad. In the kind of economy you've just described, monopolies, we shouldn't be fearful of them in the same way. Is that right?
Well, in the ideas economy, you are given a temporary monopoly. That is what the government grants you. Now, you have to manage those monopolies and making sure that people don't misbehave, and so you can have anti-competitive positions and situations, and people can game the system. But the definition of the ideas economy is government-granted monopolies that are temporary, and you just have to make sure that people don't game the system to make them permanent and be able to spread them into new areas that makes a permanent overlord and a permanent underclass. And that's why you have to look at how they change the rules and the regulations and trade agreements and all these kinds of things conspire. If you don't do them right, the rich just get permanently richer, and the not rich become an underclass. And so, yeah, it's a completely different system than the production economy of post-World War II.
In which case, can you understand why nobody seems to be following this in Ottawa, given that they're using a political system that was created 400 years ago and sort of traditional siloed governmental bureaucracies and so on? I mean, it's no wonder people can't get their head around that.
Look at what Korea's done in 40 years, come from nothing to be incredible. Look what Israel's done, where they would say themselves, they couldn't, do any R&D in the 70s. Korea was a backwater. I mean, many of these places were, and you get, they're just utter powerhouses, along with certainly, Finland and, and Sweden. And so you know what, lots of places had old systems or no systems. So, we don't have a good excuse other than the fact that we have this aversion to bringing in experts. We have outdated thinking. We're captured by these foreign lobbying companies, and and my strong advocacy is that we begin, I want our politicians to regulate for the public good.
I want to turn our attention now, and it's going to take me a moment here to set this up, but there's something going on the waterfront of Ontario's capital city.
Really?
Called Quayside Sidewalk. And you have written about this, and this is a parcel of land that is supposed to be developed as a quote-unquote smart city. But here's what you've written about it. You say Sidewalk Toronto is not a smart city. It is a colonizing experiment in surveillance capitalism, attempting to bulldoze important urban, civic, and political issues. Of all the misguided innovation strategies Canada has launched over the past 3 decades, this purported smart city is not only the dumbest, but also the most dangerous.
Yes.
Why dumb?
Well, the reason it's dumb is, at many levels. First of all, when you deal with these kinds of issues, they're very technical, and it requires expertise, and you must be very deliberate and systemic. So the people who made this decision have no expertise whatsoever on these IP and data issues. So it would be like me walking into a neurosurgery operating clinic and say, can I have a turn? Or an operating theater, can I have a turn?
But it's city council to city council. They've got to make the decision.
But it wasn't made by city council. It was made by a board that is not accountable to that, with no democratic input, with no expertise, and you're mixing a land development with the digital nervous system of a society. And so, and because data spreads seamlessly, the policy there is going to set the policy for all of Canada. So we have a rogue agency with no expertise operating outside of its government prescribed mandates, and this tail is wagging the dog of the digital nervous system of the whole country. And you have to understand that the person who controls the data controls the people and the things that interact with it. So it undermines our personal autonomy, it affects our values, it affects our sovereignty, it affects our prosperity, it affects our security. So no, that's the dangerous part of it. So I talked about the dumb, and there's the dangerous, yeah. And I stand behind that all the way.
This is, one of the things I read in preparation for this, 90% of the world's data has been created in the past 2 years.
Yeah.
That is astonishing.
Yeah, yeah.
Huh.
Well, what's happening is that, there'll be something to the tune of, I think they'll triple the number of sensors in the next 3-4 years. I think they'll say 46 billion. So you have this enormous wall of data being generated. And then what they found is if you can run algorithms on that, you can profile and target people and things. You can run systems and you can influence their behavior. You can turn the values of assets up and down. So the person who controls the data really controls your society.
Would it give you added comfort if it were a Canadian company collecting that data?
No, not particularly, because what I'm really saying is that when it comes to civic data, it's about your relationships, it's about your consumption patterns, it's about yourself, it's about assets. So the most important thing is that you have to have a dialogue between the government and the citizens, what they want, and whatever system you have, it has to be very, very democratically accountable and controlled as public infrastructure, because it's the whole marbles of, it's the new nervous system of how a society operates. So what happened is they snuck in the digital nervous system in a real estate development project. And you got to remember, this was done before the Cambridge Analytica. And you know, Google got caught manipulating kids with YouTube and tracking people without their permission. So everyone kind of was a little kind of drawn in by the halo of it. And now what's happened is the bloom is off the flower, and people are going, my goodness, these firms just actually shift public good to private gain. And people, you know, aren't comfortable with that. I mean, they would have the power to shape elections if they chose to, and we've seen that these social media companies do that for private gain.
Sidewalk Labs, in their promotional material, promise that this will be a place that's enhanced by digital technology and data without giving up the privacy and security that everyone deserves. Do you think that's achievable?
Well, what they do is they play the look over there, because you have to understand that privacy is a subset of a much, much bigger set of issues. Just because I never breach privacy doesn't mean I'm not controlling you for my own private good. Am I okay with the ethics that you're doing? Am I okay with you know, who gives you the right to collect that information on me without my knowing on the first place? Am I okay with you taking over my personal autonomy, profiling my relationships, affecting my life? Who determines the ethics of how the system works? So, no, this is not about privacy. This is about control and sovereignty. I
have talked to people in that chair who say the notion of expectations of privacy in this kind of digital universe in which we live is a pipe dream, and we should just let it go. What do you say?
Well, I think that's defeatist, and I think it's signing up for tech determinism, and I think that's the mistake. If you look at what Europe did with, they set up a whole lot of regulations that said they can't collect information on you without your express approval. You cannot de-anonymize data that you've collected anonymized. They have the right to delete it. You have a right to have portability. No, you can regulate these things. These companies operate in a sovereign national legislative construct. I go right back to what I said in the very beginning. We need a government to regulate and govern for the public interest. And there's very clear examples of that happening all throughout Europe. But they had a 10-year conversation. We haven't even begun the conversation, let alone the legislation. And that's my imploring, that we have to start paying attention to these IP assets and data assets, not only for their economic effects, but for their non-economic effects.
You've been beating this drum for a long time.
Yes, I have.
Are they listening to you?
What happens is because these things have to be expert-led and deliberate and systemic, it really does mean a reorientation from a lot of traditional approaches. And so it is a bit of a sobering time, but I am a bit deluged for input and presentations and engagement, and as are the various CEOs, and as are the various expert researchers that have kind of garnered on this. So, you know, there is a bit of an awakening happening, which is great, but that's a very sobering moment that you realize that, you know, cigarette machines in the school cafeteria were a bad idea. So,
well, let's in our remaining moments here, I want to take you back to a speech you gave last November to the IMF, and you called for, quote, a historic gathering of key decision makers to forge a new global framework for addressing current challenges posed by the data-driven economy, which is a fairly gutsy suggestion, considering we live in rather anti-globalist times. You may have noticed. Hello. What would, if you were, you know, in the best of all worlds, the way you see it, what would be the best possible outcome of such a gathering?
Sure. Well, I believe in innovation, I believe in capitalism, and I believe in human potential. So what's happened with the digital systems is our institutions are antiquated for how the economy shifted. You know, 16% of the Standard & Poor's 500 companies was intangibles in the mid-70s. Now it's 90%. So it's completely different. And really what you have to do is understand that the way we run these systems, there's a lot of inequality right now. There's a lot of cyber threats. There's a lot of grabbing of sovereignty and personal autonomy. And then what you're seeing in all this is real rivalries between blocks in the world, and they're not compatible. And so what's happening is it's compromising economic growth, it's compromising human welfare. So What do I think? I think we have to sit down and say, you know, playing a game of chicken between the US and China and then Europe kind of trying to stay out of the way is no way to run a global system. And we need institutions that come to terms with this new reality, and we have to come to terms with the new rules. But right now, we don't have agreement on how to deal with the digital system in the world. So people are playing games of chicken and rivaling and taking down the WTO and, you know, being real overly aggressive.
Who's trying to do that more, Trump or China?
Well, Trump. What's happening is China filed more patents last year than the U.S. and Europe and Japan and Korea combined. So they said, "Oh boy, I kind of like this IP maximalism of WTO. I think I can outplay that." And then the U.S. sees that as an economic rival. So they say, "Well, let's disable the WTO," and then where's the world left? And so it shows that these institutions are out of date. They were good for just taking down tariffs and trading in tangible, you know, production that we all know. But when you go to ideas, you know, we don't have global agreement on how to deal with data and IP right now.
I know you're a fan of Sun Tzu, The Art of War. If you were channeling him right now, what kind of advice do you think he'd have, given the times we're in?
To Trump, you saying?
Sure.
Sure. Well, what I'd say to him and is that America is a $7 to $8 trillion a year industry based on intangibles. So if you play a game of chicken and ask China to bow, I don't think they can afford to bow. This is their system, this is their view. So, you know, they actually need global accord to keep their businesses going. So it's a very, very dangerous game of chicken. I think the best path forward is some kind of new global arrangement, or, you know, America may play a game of chicken that they've got the most to lose because they're just so strong and powerful in the world. If that just gets disabled, and the thing is if welfare and growth are unbounded with the new accord, they're the ones that are best poised to prosper in the world. But China's here; it's here forever. It's not going away. And you have to come to arrangements with them. But people are never comfortable with reordering. I'm not making, you know, that's just a fact of the situation. But that's the challenge that's happening right now is China wants a reordering, and parts of America is not comfortable with that.
Should we do this again in a few years and see if we've made any progress?
I would love to, Steve.
Okay, you're on. That's Jim Balsillie, Council of Canadian Innovators, and of course, the former co-CEO of RIM. Thanks, Jim.
It's a pleasure, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.